And for a visual description of myself, I'm a white and East Asian person with long brown hair in a red shirt. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. If you need a restroom, they're in the cafe to the left past the deli case. History Café, as a series, is presented in partnership with HistoryLink on the third Wednesday of every month. But tonight's iteration of History Café is also presented through the Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau program. Humanities Washington is a nonprofit organization dedicated to sparking conversation and critical thinking, and it provides many other cultural programs to hundreds of thousands of people throughout Washington each year. Thanks to support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Washington Secretary of State, the Thomas S. Foley Institute for Public Policy and Public Service at Washington State University, and generous private donors, Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau presenters visit all corners of the state. I would encourage you to visit their website, www.humanities.org, to find other events like this one. And as we ground in the space tonight and think about community and communication, it's important to acknowledge that here at MOHAI, we're on the historic and contemporary lands and waters of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and all Coast Salish people. Historically, Native communities were forcibly removed from this place, with lasting impacts on the land and water today. And still, we must continue to hold deep respect and gratitude for their continued endurance and unbroken stewardship of this place. So we encourage you to visit the websites of local tribes to learn more about the people whose land you're on. And with that, tonight's speaker is Avery Dame-Griff. He's a lecturer in women's and gender studies at Gonzaga University, specializing in LGBTQ studies, political organizing, and the history of technology. He founded and serves as primary curator of the Queer Digital History Project, an independent community history project cataloging and archiving pre-2010 LGBTQ spaces online. His book, The Two Revolutions, A History of the Transgender Internet, tracks how the internet transformed transgender and political organizing from the 1980s to the contemporary moment. Dame-Griff lives in Spokane. Please give him a warm round of applause.
Thank you so much, Sor, for that wonderful introduction. And I guess I should note, as it says, I have the address for the Queer Digital History Project up here. I also, so I remember, there is swag on the table in the back. There are also some artifacts of some of the stuff I'll be talking about in the talk, if after the talk you're interested in looking at that. All right, so when I begin this talk, I usually start with me. So when I grew up, there were always two computers in our house. There was one for my father, who he used for his job as a systems administrator. So for those unfamiliar with that term, he made sure all the servers worked, basically, at his job. And I got his hand-me-downs. You can see a photo of my PC from 1995 here. This was not exactly top of the line at the time, but for a 7-year-old, this was a pretty nice setup. And so because of the nature of my father's job, we also had a home internet connection much earlier than a lot of my peers. I have these memories of us sitting side by side on these weekend nights where he is working on some issue with a server for work, and I am chatting with strangers online. However, the thing about these narratives is that they're really generational. And so there'll be parts of this talk that'll be at the beginning and end, they'll be a little more conversational. So I always sort of start this out with, out of curiosity, so what are your early memories of the internet and of using computers? You know, what is the stuff that you remember that stands out to you? It's fair. I was actually, before the talk, I was talking to Sora about a thing. So I teach this, about this with my students. We have to explain to them, Cassettes were data formats. It used to be what you got was a cassette. You didn't get like a floppy. Or sometimes I was joking to Sora when I explained to, again, I teach undergraduates my research. I will play them the sound of a 56K modem. And I think depending on your age, you may have the sense memory of the weird creakiness of that sound. And they do being like, that was the sound of the internet. I'm not going to pick on anybody, but sometimes when I have younger groups, definitely multiple people have mentioned Webkins and or Neopets. All right, I'm glad I got some excitement for Neopets. It may also be chat, it may also be like different forums, but the idea is like these memories, they stick with us in some way because they tell us something about ourselves or our experience. Because I think we often think about these digital technologies as it is a digital thing. It is ones and zeros supposedly in a screen, but they're also very physical. They're about thinking about how you occupy the space, how you use it. I don't really talk about very much in this talk, but this can also be depending on the age you were. If you live through the era of the family computer, depending on your own personal experience and identity, it might be waking up at midnight so you can go use the computer when your parents aren't awake because some of the things you want to learn about and read about are maybe things that you're not sure you're ready to talk to them about. But that's also like a physical sense presence of, okay, I got to make sure to wake up. I got to go. The computer can't be too loud because what if they wake up when they hear me clicking? Because, of course, mechanical keyboards are also a thing in the 90s. So we have these particular memories, and I think like they tell us something about ourselves. And so for me, this was also a deeply personal revelation. So if you used enough early text chat, you became really familiar with answering this question over and over. ASL, standing for age, sex, location. Now it'd probably more accurately be age, gender, location, AGL. So in my moment of answering this question over and over as maybe like 7 to 10-year-old, I had this realization. I could lie. I never lied outright because I was not an exciting child. I followed rules, but this ability to essentially lie by omission about my gender was this practice I would engage in repeatedly throughout my early years online. I wanted people to just assume I was male, and I would never correct them, and it worked out great, in theory. But looking back, this practice kind of fits within my own larger trans experience, because I'm one of those folks who really grew up online. And when I came out in late 2006, and at this time I was an undergraduate at the University of Alabama, Tuscaloosa, I didn't know any trans people in my daily life. Instead, I connected through trans-specific groups online, and I relied on digital guides to find resources and get advice. So my experience is just one anecdotal example, but it represents just some of the ways LGBTQ individuals benefited from digital communications. And though I didn't know it at the time, LGBTQ folks had been connecting via computer since the early 1980s, long before I was chatting away. So in this talk, I'm going to discuss how these early communities during the 80s and 90s opened up new avenues for LGBTQ community building and political activism. I'm especially focused on this within Washington State. So during this kind of historical moment, digital communication could be both deeply personal and local. Not only did folks know they were communicating with another human, but these online connections could become a conduit for building community offline. And so by the end of this talk, I'd like to ask us to consider how these histories might also help us rethink how and why we connect online. So, but before we get to that, there we go. I wanted to offer a little bit of background on the place of computer communication in the US prior to the World Wide Web. I know definitely for some of you, this will be less of a new history and more of a recounting of your lived experience. But for those who are less familiar, it's important to note that folks had a very different relationship to computers than we do now. Though personal computers were becoming more common by the mid-1980s, you would have still called them microcomputers at the time, they were by no means ubiquitous. The popular image of the computer is probably best represented by the 1983 film War Games, which is the image over here on the left. It's a technical tool used for business and bureaucracy, but it's also the realm of hackers and geeks. Computers don't really become a shared family appliance, a thing that every middle-class home is assumed to have, until the late 1980s and early 2000s, the era of dude, you're getting a Dell. And so if you have a computer in the mid-80s, there are several different ways for you to communicate with other folks. If you are somebody at a university or select corporations, you can access Usenet, which was a decentralized network, began in 1980. Notably, the group for gay topics, soc.mods, was so popular it eventually spawned a yearly meetup that continues to this day, MotsCon. However, for folks who are primarily just connecting from at home, they are most commonly using commercial services like CompuServe, Prodigy, QLink, which would go on to become America Online, or General Electric's Genie. Yes, General Electric basically ran a social media platform in the 80s. These are all what's called, this kind of term, walled gardens. They offer a lot of services, but they really limit users' access to any other kind of outside network. They want to keep you inside of the garden. And while there were LGBTQ spaces in all of these services, and I'm happy to talk in Q&A if folks are curious, I'm actually going to be focusing on their scrappier independent alternatives, the bulletin board system, or BBS. So this is a photo of a BBS here. As you can tell, it's just essentially one microcomputer, a modem, some associated equipment like external hard drives. These could be much larger, but most of them were relatively small. So BBSs were some of the first publicly available ways folks could communicate via modem. This graphic, which has been floating around the internet for many years, I've never been able to source it, but it basically lays out the process. Using your modem through your computer, you call the BBS's phone number. It connects you to the BBS's modem, located on the other end of the phone line, and if that line is open and available, you can then log in to the bulletin board system. So at its core, the bulletin board system is basically just a server that has lots of different functions. You can use it to chat, there are forums when you can have asynchronous messaging, you can send and receive email, you can also access files that are hosted. In some way, we can think of it as the very first form of social media. So this is a screenshot from a modern BBS that's run by a retro computing enthusiast. So it gives you a sense of what's available. It's worth knowing, so on this slide, I've got some of the differences between corporate services and BBSs. And this is this important distinction. While they shared a lot of technical functions with corporate platforms, that's basically where the similarities end between these corporate spaces and bulletin board systems. Unlike corporate services, BBSs could be free. All you needed was the equipment to call in, or they were funded by donations or subscriptions. However, BBSs were never really a money-making prospect. They were very much a labor of love for the folks who ran them. They were also could be really fragile, prone to going offline without advance notice. Or in some of my favorite stories will be about folks who ran BBSs. It will be, if they were younger, the BBS would come online when they got home from school, and or it would come online when all the family went to bed, so you could open up your telephone line, so it would only be available from like 9 p.m. to 7 in the morning, because you weren't using your phone line. They were also often deeply connected to their local communities. Because, again, you're using home landlines, most users are dialing within their area code because that's affordable. If you are dialing to a BBS long distance, then that is a long distance phone call and you're paying by the minute. That could get very expensive. So we see as the result that kind of the boundaries between online and offline tend to blur. And this also makes it easier to have community-specific BBSs. So there were many LGBTQ-specific BBSs. Glib and The Backroom, which I have ads for here, are two of the most well-known. Glib was based out of Washington, D.C., The Backroom out of New York City. These boards offered safe spaces for users to communicate or access information. These features became especially important during the early years of the AIDS crisis, when forums like The Backroom's Survivors gave PWAs, or people with AIDS, a stigma-free space for discussing their experiences. So within Washington State, there are quite a few LGBTQ-themed BBSs, including the Duval Pride Line, Waka Waka, the Seattle-Tacoma Area Gay Exchange, or Stage, Emerald On-Ramp, Rendezvous, the Cyberqueer Lounge, 28 Barbary Lane, and the Seattle AIDS Information BBS. So in this talk, I'm going to be focused specifically on, I'm not used to not seeing my slides. I'm going to be focused on the last two of these. Briefly, because I put it here, my slides are out of order. One of the other things to know about BBSs that'll come up, especially when we talk about 28 Barbary Lane, is that they get these because it's locally focused, they get these online-offline connections. So this is a screenshot provided to me by the person who ran it of Multicom 4 based out of Rochester, New York, and they would regularly have offline parties. And he would say, I would have hundreds of people who use the BBS come to my parties. And like I said, we'll see this a little later on with 28 Barbary Lane. So especially these last two, 28 Barbary Lane and the Seattle AIDS Information BBS, or SCI-BBS, they not only epitomize the BBS's key features, but also how BBS can go beyond just being this digital forum as a sort of reference, but to become a fixture within the local community. So I'm going to start us out with 28 Barbary Lane, or 28 BBL, as it was commonly known. 28 BBL was both the earliest and longest lasting gay and lesbian BBS in Washington State. It remained online for an impressive 12 years. And again, we're sort of used to an internet where things are around forever. For BBS, 12 years is a substantial amount of time. So it was founded in March 1985 by Sysop J.D. Brown, who was inspired by his own encounters using bulletin boards, which he'd initially sought out as an alternative to the local bar scene. And he really hoped to create a space where users could find resources and have essentially a positive experience like he had found in him using BBSs. However, in 1985, the BBS was still a relatively new technology, and it could have a steep learning curve in terms of creating one and also using one, as Brown knew from his own process, sort of learning again in 1984. So in a 1990 interview, he admitted to the Seattle Gay News that he needed the help of a technologically savvy, and this is a quote from him, 15-year-old punk rocker just to get 28 BBL up and running. And given how unfamiliar most folks were with the technology, Brown turns to this literary analogy that was likely familiar to his possible readers due to its LGBTQ themes, Armistead Maupin's Tales of the City series. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with this, 28 Barbary Lane is the address of the boarding house that's at the center of the Tales novels. They're set in San Francisco, and the novel and its many sequels follow the intertwining lives of all of the house's tenants, some of whom are queer identified and some are not, as well as its unconventional landlady, Mrs. Madrigal, who we learn by the end of the first novel is actually trans. So using this boarding house analogy really transformed this digital technology of what could be like a flat file structure into a more comprehensible 3D space. Brown named each of the board's forums after different spaces in Maupin's boarding house, as well as a few others. Without even knowing their contents, the titles make each forum's purpose clear. It's also worth noting that users reconfigured existing community terminology to reflect the different ways they were using their bodies. So in the bedroom, users who were looking to connect with other people weren't engaging in S&M, which was this term from the bar scene called standing and modeling. Just trying to hook somebody up. But they would call it sitting and modeming. So in its first few years, the board is really expanding rapidly, and it very quickly outgrew its existing hard drives. And as folks would throughout the board's existence, members donated the funds necessary to purchase more storage space. So they're always looking for ways to kind of make sure that the board continues going. By 1990, the board had over 1,000 registered members and was voted the best BBS in Washington State in the trade magazine Board Watches, their annual reader poll of basically what are the best BBSs. Board Watch notably had a very wide audience, very few of whom were LGBTQ identified. So it says something that it manages to rise to the top. It's worth knowing interacting on 28 Barbary Lane made folks feel safe, even for those who couldn't be out yet, because they were able to explore their identity and forge connections within the community without having to use their real name. As it sort of says in this quote, the only person who knows who they are is the sysop. So it gives them a chance to kind of explore who they want to be. And in some cases, the offline connections folks would build, or the online connections folks would build, would transition to offline friendships or even romance. So these two listings from the Seattle Gay News are just a few examples of folks who first met on 28 Barbary Lane and would eventually get married. So in the only oral history I've done so far with a 28 Barbary Lane regular, she compared her relative comfort calling up a friend she'd made via the BBS to hang out versus her experience in Facebook groups for queer women of color in Seattle. Whereas she had felt totally comfortable taking a 4-hour car ride with someone she'd only met on 28 BBL, which was a thing that appalled her like non-BBSing, non-computery sister at the time. She told me she could never imagine doing the same thing with somebody she'd met via Facebook. However, it's worth knowing not all of these interactions are friendly. It is the internet before the internet. And members did and could come into conflict. But when they had an issue, they could discuss it with the systems operator directly. As you see in this piece from a 1992 piece on 28 Barbary Lane in the Seattle Gay News. And even when users disagreed with whatever decision the systems operator made, the fact that they could have these one-on-one conversations highlights how interpersonal these interactions were. It wasn't just you having a flame war with some anonymous person, but it might be somebody you could see at one of these meetups. And some of these events were purely social. They were just sort of like annual get-togethers. Other ones were about fundraising awareness, such as in this case for Hands Off Washington, which was a campaign that ran in 1993. 28 Barbary Lane was also notable for its active women's forum, Womenwood. Most BBSs were dominated by men, and 28 Barbary Lane was no exception. It had an estimated ratio of 7 members who identified as men for every one who identified as a woman. However, Womenwood offered female-identified members a space where they felt comfortable sharing their concerns. In fact, they were the first forum to have a volunteer moderator, as the male sysop felt uncomfortable moderating this female-only space. It was very clear that this should be a space for you guys to have together. And as members became comfortable with this space, they actually used it for political organizing. So in mid-1991, Womenwood members were engaged in this ongoing community debate over whether Seattle bars and taverns were welcoming to women. So in response, a Womenwood user with the handle or nickname Vanilla Dyke, A+ nickname, leveraged the BBS's reach to connect this large network of queer women, some of whom likely had no social connections outside of the BBS, to organize what she called Operation Tavern Storm, which was a one-night takeover of the local gay nightclub Neighbors. So the users of Womenwood focused on Neighbors in particular based on the visual and textual rhetoric of their advertising. As you can see here, there's sort of a particular focus on masculinity, on men, sexy men, and also some of the language they used in these ads, like as a quote from here, where men are free to be who they are. And so as essentially part of this takeover, she organized all these women to show up for this one night. In the piece in the Seattle Gay News that describes this after it happens, they say about 40 women were lined up outside of Neighbors before it actually opened, and then approximately 100 women participated. And according to the coverage, like I said, in the Seattle Gay News, it's described as this air of sisterly joviality pervaded throughout the night. And they imagine that the takeover's impact would be felt long after. So it's a way for women to kind of come together and sort of, as I would describe it, like they say, we're here, we're queer, we'd like to buy beer. Won't you sell it to us too? So it's a way to essentially engage in some kinds of consumer activism over this issue. However, beyond just having these social spaces, the BBS was also a key venue for spreading information during the early years of the AIDS epidemic. So boards like the AIDS Info BBS in San Francisco, and that's the ad over there on the left, and the HIV AIDS Info BBS, which was later renamed IGIS in San Juan Capistrano, California, they both offered access to social support and the latest research on AIDS trials and treatments for folks who dialed in. And Washington State had its own AIDS-specific BBS, the Seattle AIDS Information BBS, or shortened to SCI BBS. Founded in late 1989, it gave callers free access to treatment news, lists of local resources, and an anonymous forum where PWAs, again, people with AIDS, could ask questions and offer support. It's worth noting one of the reasons at the time the computer communication in AIDS was so transformative was about getting access to information. I think one of the things we sort of forget now is that you knew so little about what was happening with AIDS that having access to the latest research felt vital. And so BBSs allowed doctors, medical professionals, and people who are kind of AIDS activists to get the latest research within hours as opposed to weeks or days. So, and you could also get that information no matter where you lived. So notably IGIS, which was founded by Sister Mary Elizabeth, who was a nun. She was inspired to found it by her experience working with rural PWAs in Missouri who could not access information about their condition, and they could not get that information to their doctors. And so she realized when you can get it on a computer, you can get that to people who cannot access this in a physical space. So the computer becomes this key way for sharing information for folks who can't get out of their homes or do not live in a major metropolitan area. And all of this was particularly important in light of what the founding CISOP of SCI-BBS, Steve Brown, had observed in his time using Seattle area BBSs. He was a PWA, and he found when he would want to talk about HIV/AIDS, other individuals were hesitant to discuss it, even if they were also currently living with or supporting someone with a disease. There was a kind of fear about being visible talking about this thing. So according to Brown, the anonymity of a bulletin board system, your body is behind the computer, you're not kind of talking face to face, it made it the perfect medium for lonely and fearful PWAs to first become comfortable with discussing their situation with others, to seek the companionship and support they need without revealing their identity. And also notably, once they were online, the BBS also offered them ways to connect with local AIDS-related organizations through its online support group, which was led by volunteers from the Seattle Treatment Exchange Project. However, unlike 20th Barbary Lane, SCI-BBS never charged for its services, which meant it had no built-in financial support. Because the board's founding principle to Brown was about universal information access and support, regardless of users' ability to pay. For him, the most important thing was that they always had access. So in light of this, SCI-BBS incorporated as a 501c3 nonprofit, and it kind of kept itself afloat through getting small grants and accepting donations. So this choice to incorporate as a nonprofit was in line with Brown's philosophy, which emphasized the fight against HIV/AIDS as a collective group effort. He also worked closely with other AIDS BBSs, and he served as the first vice president for the International IGIS Network, which was created in 1992 to help AIDS BBSs across the U.S. quickly circulate essential medical information. And a part of why these networks notably mattered was, again, because a BBS is based on your local phone connection, they were essentially kind of able to hop from BBS to BBS, so they're making only sort of these small local or short distance phone calls, so it wasn't as expensive to circulate that information. However, notably, Brown's activism also extended beyond the BBS. He did several other different things, such as organizing drug donation drives. This is about getting necessary AIDS medications to folks outside the United States. Running the Puget AIDS Net service, which faxed the CDC's Daily Digest and other CDC reports to 50 organizations throughout Seattle. Again, we do not think of faxing as an exciting technology, but the ability for some of these places to get this information immediately and essentially for free was really important. And collecting and distributing donated computers to PWAs who couldn't afford them. So for these are for folks who are isolated and can't access it. Where is my slide? So I'm so used to having my slides in front of me. For folks who can't access it, it gives them the tools they need to actually access the BBS. There we go. I apologize. These are old slides that are out of order. All right. Yeah, there we go. It's also worth noting local sysops also contributed to the board's efforts. When SciBBS had to go offline in 1994 due to limited funds, again, this eternal problem of we want to do this thing, but it's really expensive to accept all these phone calls. So they go offline in 1994 because Brown just can't afford it. Members of 28 Barbary Lane actually worked to raise enough money to keep the board online for several months. And they later ran a fundraiser for SciBBS at their annual board sort of birthday party. And they weren't the only ones. Several different other BBSs, when they would have in-person meetups or in other ways, they would essentially use that as a way to raise funds for SciBBS. However, as that story in this clipping kind of implies, SciBBS would actually go on to close because of the budget issues. So it closes in early 1996. And at the time, Brown told the Seattle Gay News that donations had dropped off precipitously. And taking on $1,200 in debt to keep the system running was simply too much. However, he really remained committed to, first off, keeping Puget AIDS Net alive, so continuing to fax that information, but also this idea that he might possibly revive the BBS as a paid service in the future. So in these stories, as we can sort of see, the bulletin board system is this example of this core set of unique features that set them apart at the time. First off, they have this kind of online-offline barrier that is permeable. You're both connected with people digitally, but you're also connecting to folks kind of offline and having this essentially an embeddedness within the community. There is anonymity that allows safety. It provides space for political organizing, especially organizing out with a kind of large network of folks you might not know in your daily life. But also notably, all of these are community owned. They're owned by people invested in the community and in continuing to support the community. Now, I have a quick question. So before this talk, how many of you had ever even heard of a bulletin board system? That's more than I thought. That's good. How many have actually used one? Oh, all right, I got a couple of you. So we've got some, but obviously not everyone. And sometimes when I give this kind of talk, especially like I say, when I teach it to students, they will look at me like, we only know about this because you made us read what you've written. I was like, okay. But we don't really know a lot about them. If you know about them, you're likely someone who's already inclined to know about it, or you were someone who used them. So the question is, how did we end up here with so many of like these vibrant spaces largely forgotten? And the thing is, pretty much the World Wide Web is what happened. Websites didn't have the same limitations as the BBS and its corporate competitors, and they totally upended the economics of digital communications. So as you can see, and so this graph is taken from Kevin Driscoll's excellent book, The Modem World, which is a history of the BBS, the emergence of the World Wide Web starting in 1994 going into 1995, leads many BBSs to close. Essentially, their use drops off a cliff in around 1995. And based on advertisements in the Seattle Gay News, 28 Barbary Lane holds on until about 1997, but even it wasn't able to withstand the rise of the web. Those BBSs that did survive, they managed to do so by becoming internet service providers, as did their corporate competition like AOL. On the web, the BBS was replaced by new gay-specific portals like Planet Out, Gay.com, Gay.net, as well as community-specific sites like the Transgender Forum. Like the BBS, these sites offered both information and opportunities for communication, like site-specific forums or those anonymous chat rooms. Compared to the BBS, however, they were much easier to access and use, but they also lacked that particular kind of local flavor. However, the BBS wasn't totally gone. Brown actually attempted to revive 28 Barbary Lane as a web-based message board in 2003, though it doesn't seem to have been able to capture the same level of success as its BBS predecessor. It's also worth noting that as folks are learning this technology, along with these sites came specific guidebooks. We often forget that as folks are now learning this technology, they have to learn how to use it, so they're going to go buy a book about the internet. Yet all of like this moment I'm talking about of the web is still relatively open as a platform. Because notably, when users didn't like the services of atmosphere of one, they could always seek out another. The rise of social media platforms, most notably, sort of especially going into the contemporary moment, beginning with Facebook and MySpace in the mid-2000s, they accelerate this shift back toward corporate-friendly walled gardens. Because if you think about like contemporary social media now, how is it similar to some of the stuff we've talked about with the BBS, but what's different? I'm going to throw it out to you guys. All right, they're not as open, no. What other like similarities or differences? We're pretty identity focused at the time, yeah. Oh yes, you need to use, as Facebook will tell you, your real name or you do not count. I will come back to discussion. I expect we'll come back to Discord because I think Discord has a lot of similarities. I'll come back to that because I think, yeah, we see like some of these similarities and differences. You know, you can build rapport, you can make these social connections, but it's not as connected to your local community. Notably, I think the biggest thing is it's not something the community controls. The platform is beholden to a corporate shareholder. It's beholden to someone it has to make money to. It is beholden to what the company thinks is best for its bottom line. And so this is why I sort of tell the story of BBS, is to get us thinking that maybe there's something else, or to think about what is our current media landscape and to imagine what could be different. This is why I say because like we sort of see the way in some of which what we have before, actually how these issues kind of impact LGBTQ users. how they've increasingly found that their presence becomes problematic for platforms' sort of corporate goals. So these are headlines going from about 2018 to 2023. Like I said, I think this history can be illuminating because it shows us how the internet we have now isn't inevitable. And to put it on theme, as I said, we're at the Museum of History and Innovation. So I sort of end this talk with this kind of thought exercise about maybe trying some innovation of our own to kind of open us up into the Q&A. Is how could we design something different that was inspired by what we see from the BBS? Or like, what are current platforms we see that have some kind of similarities that we could, again, see as maybe the basis for a different kind of way of connecting online?
We got some microphones too, if you have a longer form answer. Yeah, Bryce.
I would think part of the answer is breaking away from corporate funding. Anything that you want to do, you cannot be beholden financially to a corporation that needs to make money from it.
I'm trying to do a thing I don't do when I teach. Sometimes I'll like hop in to like answer the students, like to respond to the student. I think that's it, because you mentioned Discord, because this is where I think Discord presents an interesting case of they have a lot of these features, but then they're still corporate. So I should also note, are there any folks who are unfamiliar with how Discord works? Okay, I see a couple. That's why I wanted to make sure. So you can think of as essentially Discord allows for essentially kind of like private chat servers that have a lot of other features with them, but essentially they're smaller private communities. The community is in control of moderation. It can define its own rules, but it's still sort of hosted by this corporate platform. But it's most similar to probably the BBS, and that allows for a lot of this smaller, and it can also be localized or connected to some sort of local offline community. Sometimes when I teach about this, one of the things I note is that Discord also became very popular during the pandemic for LGBTQ youth who couldn't get out, who couldn't get access to spaces. A lot of like, when I think about kind of Discord servers on college campuses, often it may be something kind of hosted and run by the student LGBTQ group, or by like the local nonprofit. In Spokane, Odyssey Youth Movement has a very active Discord server that they moderate and oversee to provide this kind of space for students and for young people who can't come into their physical location.
So I've been a part of some Discord servers. I haven't moderated anything. I'm also on Reddit and a couple other places. I'm not on Facebook or Twitter. X, whatever it's called anymore.
It's Twitter. It's not X.
It's a dumpster fire. That's what it is. But one of the questions I have is around like community in general. So online, offline. I feel like now it's just really hard to nurture and sustain community in general. I found like even queer spaces in Seattle now have just sort of mostly, especially if you are not AMAB in general, I think it's really hard to just sort of sustain community. So trying to answer your question, I'm really struggling because I'm like, I think generally community is just so hard to sustain. Even like some of the various like communities online I've been a part of have basically just like their half-life is like so short. So 12 years seems like a long time for any sort of community. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like I'm struggling. I mean, the only thing I can think of is like, how do you sort of support mods better? Like how as a community do we like value mods better? Because like moderation is so important. And they do a lot of like, not just invisible, but highly visible labor that people are aware of, but like they're typically not supported. And that is sometimes the fire way that like a community will burn down. And then the other thing I was thinking of is like, just thinking about like open source communities versus like free software versus just like even getting into just sort of like community controlled and community like in the public domain. And I feel like now I'm just struggling because AWS, like Amazon owns and is hosting most of the internet. So how can we, I feel like this is starting to become very negative. So I'm just gonna stop. But I was just like, I love this question, but I'm struggling to see a future, an alternative where like in the same way. It's just very challenging given a lot of these limitations.
I know. I think this is a wonderful response to it because it is hard because this was a period where a thing like AWS didn't exist. It is the larger problem with we're not even going to touch the environmental impacts of cloud computing, but we just expect things to be there. And you'd be like, you can just go get hosting. And I'm like, but maybe I don't want to use AWS. I guess I am. Or if you are looking for something you're always connected into it. Its tendrils reach quite far. And I think I admit part of how I think about this is shaped by the fact I was also not a cool kid. I was a forum moderator from about 5th grade until I graduated high school. I was not cool. But I spent a lot of time doing that kind of moderation. This is the interesting thing is it does leave a mark. I was doing an oral history with Stacy Bias, who for about 8 years ran the site technodike.com, which was based out of Portland. And it had a lot of similar features to this. She ran forums that were very active. She did local meetups in Portland that were like Technodike sponsored and branded. And when I would kind of try to talk to her about moderation, she like several times she'd be like, "This is actually just." She's like, "My memory of this is trauma." That's my memory of this experience. Like I don't have a lot of specific memories because I remember the feeling of having to do this thing. I think it's what makes this question hard because this was certainly a thing sysops when I talked to them. Because I've not been fortunate enough to track down either Brown or either of the Browns because it was very difficult because you were sort of responsible for all of these decisions and it was sort of on you and how you interacted with your community. To give it as an anecdote, like I said, I have that screenshot because I did an oral history with the sysop who ran Multicom 4, and he has this anecdote of, so BBSs could also host games, and his boyfriend at the time had gotten addicted to Space Trader, which was a BBS game where it's a space trading game, and you're also expanding an empire. And he tells the story of one night at 3 a.m. his boyfriend like storms into their bedroom and is like, "You have to delete Gumby 500 because Gumby 500 keeps beating me." And the sysop, I remember Chaz Antonelli, he was like, I told him like, "No, it's 3 a.m. I cannot do that. I'm responsible to everyone. It's not fair for me to do that. I can't." And his boyfriend was like, "Well, if you don't, then I'm leaving." He was like, "Okay, great. You do that. It's 3 a.m. I'm going back to sleep." And his boyfriend packed up and left. That was how they broke up. But they tell the story of like he felt a responsibility to be fair to everyone. I can't just delete you because like my boyfriend is mad at you because you keep winning. And that's like, it's like a funny example, but it is like it weighs and it makes this community cards who takes on that responsibility. Like who's going to be the one to sort of do this work and how do we distribute it and how do we think about like sort of adequately compensating folks, because as I said, a lot of these spaces were labors of love. You did not make money from it. You did it because you loved your community. But it came with work. It came with feelings. It came with trauma. It came with lost relationships. One of the writing about another, the guy who ran Glib in Washington D.C. His husband called Glib the sysops mistress, and he would just, whenever something would go wrong with the board, he'd be like, "I know you have to go talk to your mistress." Like it was like there was always this third person in the relationship, and he kind of acknowledged that it was so important. He let it be a part of the relationship. I guess this also, if I have this question to start with, there are other kind of questions about this, about kind of any of the work I do with the Queer Digital History Project. I have more fun anecdotes. I'm full of anecdotes.
Okay, all I was going to add was that going off of the conversation about the finances, I think that's probably going to be a big barrier. I think, so I grew up in the, when everybody who was gay online, it was Tumblr, which is definitely aging me right there. But one thing that's different that you could, at least for like the BBSs, like the Usenet back then, is like you would see adult content, and that wasn't that weird. I think it'd be really difficult to have a website that had any kind of adult content, of which a lot of stuff gets counted as quote-unquote adult content, even if it's just something like, let's talk about puberty, or here's where you buy a tampon. So like that part of it comes with it, because I think a lot of the companies like Amex and MasterCard restrict what you can take as a payment. So I think this came up with OnlyFans, which is why they briefly had that weird period during the pandemic where they're like, now we're gonna never have adult content. And people were like, well, why would you, why would this website exist? And the answer was because I think all their financing sites were basically like, we will no longer allow you to do financing, and we'll pull you from the Apple Store, which means basically they would not be able to operate. So I wonder if like that part of it with the financing, because we're so centralized with it, if that's going to be one of the big barriers.
I think
it's a bit depressing.
It certainly fits in with the history of the internet. It's not to advertise the book, but a big part of chapter 2 of the book I wrote is about how, for many, speaking of like corporate needs and restrictions, AOL did not allow users to use the terms transsexual or transvestite because they were seen as vulgar language. So you literally couldn't use the word. And so a big part of that was this campaign by users to get that overturned so they could have a space that used essentially a word that recognized, that represented their community, that they could actually be a part of it. But a big part of like not having that was all about this fear of the presence of adult content and of access. And in that case, they're thinking about subscribers because they want to advertise AOL as family friendly. And if these quote unquote transvestites are there, it's not a family friendly space. And again, it boils back down to money. You know, what are the money concerns at the center of it? And then, yeah, I think.
This is more of a practical question. So we were talking about the BBSs needing more server space. Does that mean that everything that was entered into it was kept, and so it would just build over time? And then my corollary question is it still available, and can you review it? Which might be terribly boring, but also terribly interesting.
It is. This is, I feel like, ironically, I was for prepping for this. That sort of was the problem. It was because you had a limited amount of like actual hard drive space. When that filled up, there were a couple, like, until you could get more, you just start to have to dump it. So as an example, like GenderNet, which was the first transgender BBS, one of the things a workaround they had, because they only had this limited amount of server space, was they posted on the board essentially everybody's, like, it's like a pen pal list. Be like, you like talking to this person online, go send them something through the mail because it doesn't take up server space. That was sort of their way of be like, you made this connection, okay, well now take it off of our space because we can't afford more. So boards would just sort of dump it. The scholar Kevin Driscoll, whose book I reference, he sometimes describes these systems as having a kind of anti-memory design, where instead of sort of we now think of everything digital will be saved, it will always be there. like I said, these systems were very fragile. If you hadn't run backups of the board and it went down, like, I don't know, you had a power surge, goes backwards, fries the computer board, it's kaput if you didn't pack it up. This was a thing that could happen. So ironically, what archives we have of messages, often if it wasn't a person saving it themselves, it was because it was printed or reproduced somewhere else. One of the examples from a BBS of where we have messages is the survivor. I mentioned survivors at the very beginning from the back room. We have an archive of those messages because the moderator for that forum, David Charnow, before he passed away, he had AIDS. He really wanted to write a memoir about his experiences. And so he printed it out. He took everything he did, he just printed it on paper. And so there's this huge collection of all these messages that he was going to use to write his memoir on paper, and they're now held at the One Archive. So what we have is, it's because people, frankly, they printed it or they reproduced it in a different media, sometimes for the intent to sell it. Or like things would sort of get circulated at the time as what were called text files. And so because these had no copyright, it's basically just a plain text file with like somebody's essay about X in it. You could write whatever. It is sort of like you've thrown your thoughts out into the wild, and because these could be reproduced, at some point they often ended up printed on CD, which is why we have them. So yeah, the practice of it are hard is because we have very few archives of it. Most of what we have are people's memories, what they saved, or honestly what got printed on paper. My joke about doing this as like archival research is that I spend a lot of time bothering elders on Facebook, sending them Facebook messages they don't read because we're not friends, to ask them if they saved anything. Like, did you save stuff in your basement? And sometimes they do. To give an example from like my experience doing this work, I was put in contact with Dallas Denny, who was a major trans activist, and she donated some email archives he had. And during that conversation, at one point she was like, maybe I should plug in my Commodore 64 and see if any of that stuff was saved. So clearly she's got her Commodore. We assume it works. And there must be something like she was using it at the time for things. So it's what people have saved, honestly. I guess there'd be a question about this, other stuff about the prompt, and or, like I said, anything about the book or kind of the kind of doing this sort of archiving work. To this question, I do. I try not to give it. Look at me getting ready for my answer. I sometimes preface this answer with being, it is a very nerdy internet answer, but I think a key part of this is federation and decentralization. Is that what these systems look like is that they cannot be centralized and they cannot be corporate. One of the, I mentioned like the problems of Discord. In particular, I think about, because like Discord seems like the closest fit. They're these small private spaces. You can connect them to local physical spaces. Communities are in control of moderation norms. However, then very recently, for a long time, there was a service that was scraping people's Discord profiles. So you could see what Discords they were using. So for queer and trans users, that is going to out some of them if you know their handle. And that's about the fact that it's a centralized service. And so part of kind of how I think about this talk is to introduce people to the idea that all of these kind of BBSs, they were decentralized. They were one person with a small community invested in that community, and they owned it. They were connected to it. So I think of it as an example of like something as decentralized and federated is there is it's a Mastodon server. There's like two of you who are like, you're mentioning Mastodon. But it's called social.coop, and it's run as, I forget where the physical server is based out of, but it's run as a cooperative. So it's actually cooperatively governed. So people provide, like it's like any other co-op, you provide in funds to help support the existence of the server, but all decisions are made cooperatively. And if I remember correctly, like they elect a board to run it. And that board is responsible to its users for the decisions it makes around moderation, around how they want to run the service. And I think like these are possible sustainable models that they take the best parts of the BBS, but they also give some of that ownership back to the community. So I think like things are decentralized, that are federated, but that are especially like the community owns them. I think about this in the same way is I was listening to a podcast about the recent Hulu series about the history of Black Twitter. And someone in that podcast made the exact same point around like one of the problems for communities who make their spaces on these corporate platforms is they don't own it. And that ownership, whatever it looks like, that ownership is key. And like federation and decentralization make that ownership possible in a way that I am part of Facebook groups that I like, that are very useful. I am an adult with a small child. Facebook is basically the yellow pages, and I can't not have an account, unfortunately. But I'm also very aware that this is owned by a corporation, that this is not a thing that my community is fully in control of. And so I think, yeah, things that are decentralized, that are federated, so they're interconnected into a network, but they're not fully reliant on each other, and that the community can own and support are healthy alternatives. And like I said, my hope with this talk is, at least for folks who've never thought about it, they're like, maybe I'll think about this thing if it comes up. Be like, somebody mentioned it, be like, maybe I'll try it. You know, maybe I'll find the one that works for me.
Could you tell us? Oh, I was just curious about kind of the archiving practices that you do. Earlier, we were talking before the talk about some people you're trying to get in touch with about oral histories and archiving.
Like I said, it's even just like tracking down like information is often reliant on, I call it I sort of call the research project rabbit holing, where you get one reference and then you're following that reference in a variety of different sources. And then sometimes that can produce archival material, and sometimes that mostly produces, I found a phone number, here's a phone number and a name of a thing, and it was maybe never mentioned again. Because it's often, it's sort of like digging down to see what comes up, and then if I can use that thing to find the person who has it. So as I say, you notice in the talk there's less about the Seattle AIDS Info BBS than about 20 Barbary Lane, in part because I'm relying very heavily on the Seattle Gay News archives. Because the Seattle Gay News, one of the advantages is they actually covered BBSs relatively extensively compared to like their contemporaries in other places. But I know that like the real information lies with the people. So I'm working with the archive I have, I'm following these names, and unfortunately all of these people have very common names. So it's like sort of following the names to see if I can either find more sources or just find the people. And hope that they save something. It really is just like hoping, did you save anything from this? Or if not, can I talk to you? Because I think I became very committed to oral history when I, unbeknownst to me, met the person who founded the second trans BBS to ever be created. I met her in 2013. In 2013, when I was at the University of Kansas, and just met her out of the blue, and that's when I sort of got to know that she'd done this. I was like, oh, I should talk to her because I'm sure she has all these experiences. And then when I moved from Kansas to Maryland to start my PhD, she died unexpectedly of an aneurysm. It was totally out of the blue. No one was prepared. And I realized in the moment, it's like all of her memories of this thing went with her. What I know about the board, other than what's in the archives, is because she wrote a personal essay on a genealogy site once about her experiences, like a random genealogy site. She happened to write it. And so I really want to try to record these before folks pass, because I think it also matters to their families. I was interviewed about this about 2 years ago for like a short article online, and out of the blue I got an email from her son, and her son was just like, thank you so much for talking about what my mom did. Like, I remember her sitting at the computer like doing this, and I didn't really understand what was happening, but I knew it was important. So thank you for actually like trying to save this. He's like, I don't know I can do much. I was too young, but if you have any questions, I'll answer them. And like, I think about that interaction a lot of like this process, but also why it matters is that this stuff really mattered to these people. But if we don't save it, like, nobody knows. It's the problem of the internet history of like, I ask you about your memories. We all have these very unique memories. But if we don't save it, then it's just like, oh, that was that old thing we did. I was like, that old thing was actually really important. But we didn't think of it because it was the internet. So I tried to say, we should save it. We should think of it just the same way, think of it the same way we do as print, because it's equally as important.
I guess I have a question on that one. Like, what's been the hardest thing to track down?
Oh, God.
Or the most interesting?
I think the most interesting thing, I didn't track it down, but it was a donation from Marianne Harmon, who is sort of one of the reasons we can all use email now. She was very influential in developing UUNet, which was a protocol. Too many technical details for here. She's also trans. And she reached out to the Digital Transgender Archive, and they sent her to me. She has an archive of the very first trans mailing list, CD Forum. It ran from 1988 to 1995, and she has an archive from 1998 to 1993. And I think it's really fascinating because it is from before what we think of as an email address exists. So they're using, we'll see how many know this, bang paths, which was like essentially a way to trace back a person. You didn't have like the @ plus your traditional email address. You're still calling it ARPANET. It is not the internet yet at this period. But it's this very small, intimate space where we see a lot of these folks kind of talking and thinking about what it means to be trans. Especially at a time many of these folks were not connected to the community. This is their first way to talk about their experiences. It's this weird, fascinating archive, but because of how personal it is, it's actually one of the things about my archival practices is that some of this stuff, I don't actually have it posted publicly online. I ask folks to request access to it to do what I can to protect individuals' privacy so it's not sort of floating out into the ether. Because some of these conversations are very personal, and they were shared with the idea that this would be anonymous. But I think that's probably the most interesting because it's a window into this like particular world at the time, at this moment when how we think about transness is changing. When I think of like my white whale of archives, the thing that is such a challenge, but I really do want to get saved, is LiveJournal. I would say folks who are young people of a certain age at a time, that includes me, remember LiveJournal. And it was hugely influential for like queer and trans discourse that like, again, for a very specific like group of people. But it's also like it gives us a window in this like moment in time. It's very difficult to archive for a variety of technical reasons I won't get into, but it's like my white whale of like, I really want a project to kind of have that, save it, even if like what I call like a dehydrated form, removing some of that personally identifiable information. But just because it's now owned by a Russian corporation, all of the content is on servers in Russia. You know, it's another thing where like we made it, we should probably at least own the archives to it. But it's like my white whale, the thing I really would love to archive, but there's a lot of technical challenges to doing it.
This is going to be a weird one. So recently, with all the like Gen AI craze and the chat bots that are taking over, I'm curious of your thoughts on how it changes online spaces, and particularly spaces that like for instance, you mentioned Facebook pages or Facebook groups that you're a part of, and I know that there was a switch a while back. I mean, maybe it was like a few weeks ago for, I think Facebook had chatbots now moderate all Facebook groups. So if things are not responded to it within a certain period of time, a chatbot will respond. So I'm just curious of like your thoughts on Gen AI, chatbots, sort of interacting with like people online.
I think the interesting thing when it comes to, particularly I'll speak in terms of like kind of LGBTQ content in general, it is challenging because a thing I've seen throughout the history of this work is that part of, again, why this ownership matters is that LGBTQ content will always be a problem for a corporation because there will be some sort of like financial disincentive to like promoting it or making it available, because there will be someone who will see it as adult. AOL, before AOL, when they attempted to, like, when they opened their first sort of gay forum in 1988, one of their major investors was a computer company that really was kind of very focused on a particular kind of religious values, and they were absolutely opposed to its presence, and they leveraged their investment to get it shut down. And so, like, we've seen this continuously. And so I mentioned that says, like, whatever kind of LGBTQ content they will present will always be the most sanitized and publicly acceptable version of it. And anything, and sort of like it, I'm talking around what I think about this test for my own amusement I run all the time, which is I ask various large language models to write me coming out posts. I'm like, write me a coming out post as X. And at some point I'll be able to write me a coming out post as X in the style of Tumblr, which is the same thing, but with more emojis. In part because when you look at all of these things across the various models, you see the hands of the humans making sure that this thing looks a specific way. This is not actually modeled on the data that we're not going to get into like the ethics of how they're collecting this, but it's not modeled on the data you've scraped. It's very specifically shaped to offend the least amount of people. When I started to run this experiment, one of the first ones I sent to a very close friend who is also trans and does work in this area, and I asked them, I was like, what do you think of this thing? Like, and their response was, this is the weirdest, most like, please don't hit me for being a queer person, like very inhuman kind of letter. It was please respect me. It wasn't just like, I should be respected. It's like, please respect me in my decision. And I've seen this process repeats itself. And then I think about when you're engaging with this thing, again, it's based on model, it's based on an algorithm. When it comes to queer content, it will have been shaped so that it cannot offend, but then that doesn't reflect the real experiences of queer folks. The real experiences of, so one of the things that I don't I didn't mention was like 28 Barbary Lane. One of their forums was this soap opera they all wrote together called Pleasantville, USA. And you know, some stuff happened in Pleasantville, USA that was not PG approved. You know, that was not advertiser friendly. And so I think even say like the presence of like say like a chatbot commenting, that chatbot is not actually going to really engage with what that person is talking about, because some of what that person might be talking about will be insider community knowledge that the chatbot's not going to have access to. And so then how is it going to interpret it? It'll be interesting, let's say that, but then it pulls people out of that space. You know, or it reinforces the dominant norm of this is the way you are supposed to exist in public, because this is what is acceptable to an advertiser. This is what is acceptable to X constituency, like we feel beholden to for maybe financial reasons. And like that's a real concern for me. That for me, that this comes back to this ownership thing of like, you should own your data, you should own your space, and when you have a say over how something is governed, that say can involve, we don't want it to be scraped, we don't want these kind of things to exist in our space. So that is my thoughts. They're not terribly positive when it comes to queer content, I hate to say. Also, you can run that coming out post experiment. It is bizarre.
I do the same experiment, but I ask it to write me a love story that features two men. It will invent women for the men. They'll have a double wedding, but two women. So it like invents heterosexuality all over again. It'll be like two women, be like they're sisters. I'm like, oh, that's somehow weirder than what you could have imagined.
Or they'll at one point, again, early experimentation, and this was with an earlier GPT model, was I asked it to write me a story about a trans woman, and it wrote me a story about someone becoming a drag queen. It's like, these are two very similar but not the same concepts. But again, the model has no understanding of these particular distinctions, but it knows that I can't write a story that will offend anyone, so here we go, positive coming out narrative, done.
All right, I think that's our time for today, unless one more, maybe? Okay. Okay, so in closing, love to thank HistoryLink and thank you to Humanities Washington. And next, you can purchase Avery's book, The Two Revolutions, in the MOHAI store. So please do get a copy. He's going to stick around, and you can get your book signed. So please do that. And if you'd like to help us out here at MOHAI in public programs, continue to provide the best in regional programming, please do take a survey in the back, and we have free postcards of historical images that you can take home. So incentive there. And then finally, next month, we have our History Cafe on Tuesday, June 18th, so not our usual Wednesday, and it will be with the People of Color Against AIDS Network. So please do consider joining us on Tuesday, June 18th. And then please give Avery a warm round of applause. Thank you so much.
And I also want to say thank you for being a wonderful audience, as I realize that my thing does not match my slides. Thank you for your patience. I appreciate it.